our duty to win.
We must love each other.
We must love each other.
We must support each other.
We must support each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains. Ashe.
We have a duty to fight.
We have a duty to fight.
We have a duty to win.
We have a duty to win.
We must all protect one another.
We must all protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Welcome to Radical Cram School. We're going to learn about social justice, revolution. Hello, my young comrades. Hi. I'm going to show a picture. This is my way of figuring out if you've been tainted by the patriarchy.
Patriarchy? What? Oh, I knew that. There's just like this thing about white people that just makes me be like, I'm like, they're like right there in a pool, and I'm just like walking into the pool, and they just give me the death stare, and then I'm just like this thing about white people that just makes me be like.
White people are racist. So I put this up because I really want any white person in the room to know up front that this is what we're dealing with, that it's not going to be this coddling of white tears and what that looks like. We're not going to discuss, oh, maybe some of us have worked it out. No, you're always going to be racist, actually. So even when you're on your path to trying to figure out how to be a better human being, because I believe that white people are born into not being human, like that actually, instead of people of color and black folks being dehumanized, that actually everyone is dehumanized off rip within white supremacy, that y'all are born into a life to not be human, and that's what y'all are taught to do, to be demons. So in this particular way, white people are all racist.
Oh, no. Oh, we should film this. Oh, no.
You don't own this space. You're not entitled to this space. You're not entitled to just come, spew hate, create violent rhetoric, and make the campus unsafe and uncomfortable.
Out of this campus!
Keep your hating on this campus! Keep your hating on this campus! Keep your hating on this campus!
People, including people in positions of power and authority, who are determined to force women to bear children, regardless of the situation, the feelings and the better judgment of those women themselves.
Fucking lie!
But they...
There's no such thing as compelled speech! The government cannot tell you what to do!
We're happy for some reason. I can't really hear you because they're really loud.
It's pretty obvious that its freedom of speech is a freedom that's particularly important for people who don't have anything else, right? If you're supporting freedom of speech, you're not supporting the status quo. I mean, just think about it. Let's use the logic of the radical leftists and assume that society is a tyrannical hierarchy and the people at the top have the upper hand in everything, including access to communication. These people are not your friends. They say, you know, and mark my words, that's the sounds of the barbarians pounding at the gates. Right.
There's many fields of studies that you can get legitimate degrees in that are absolutely preposterous.
Right.
Literally filled with nonsense,
right.
Taught by nonsense people who live in these nonsense bubbles.
Right.
And then they give these degrees, and these people go out in the real world.
Exactly.
And they infect things.
Yep.
Their ridiculousness infects certain, particularly tech industry businesses.
Yep.
Like you see it infecting.
James Damore.
Yeah. Well, let's explain what you guys did.
Yeah, so we started about a year and a half ago now. It was last summer. We started writing a bunch of academic papers for the journals that represent these fields. And so everybody understands what an academic paper is getting out of the gate. This isn't like an op-ed that you dash off for like Washington Post or some magazine or whatever. This is a thing like academics work their careers to write 1 or 2 of these a year.
Yeah.
And so they're really hard to write. They're supposed to be hard to get published. So we wrote 20 of them in 10 months. And 7 of those got accepted. 4 were actually published. And
then we got
at least
busted.
4 more. Yeah, we got busted, and at least 4 more were on track. Maybe 5 or 6 more would have gotten. And so she had this whole thing that gender is performative. It's something you perform. It's not something that has anything to do with your biology.
Retracted articles.
Oh, yeah,
Human reactions to rape culture and queer performativity at urban dog parks in Portland, Oregon. Why is it retracted?
Because it's
because they realized that you guys were hosing them.
Yeah.
Human reactions to rape culture and queer performativity.
We claim to have closely examined the genitals of
just under 10,000
just
dogs.
under 10,000 dogs, and then interrogated their owners as to their sexual orientation.
So we checked out the dog's nuts and then said, "Excuse me, sir, are you gay?"
Yeah.
And you asked them if they gendered their dogs.
Yeah. Well, we made up these totally insane, dogs humping incidents and how they beat female dogs, but they didn't beat male dogs. So that's one of the papers that we made. The other paper that
Well,
we
with
wrote,
this one also, they had the whole thing like if a male dog humps another male dog, especially men would freak out and break it up.
Yeah.
Stop that, because that's the queer performativity part.
Yeah.
But then if a male dog humped a female dog, they'd be like, get her, girl. Or,
Yeah.
Get her, get on it.
So you're basically raging against heteronormativity.
That's exactly correct.
Yep.
We told them exactly what they wanted to hear, and we gave them bogus statistics to fuel what they already wanted to believe.
Yeah, we started off with the idea that what we wanted to get to was a conclusion, and then we made up all the crap in between to get to it. And the conclusion was feminism should train men the way we train dogs so that we can get rid of rape culture.
Put them on leashes. It's right in the paper. It's all
is.
there. Unfortunately, we cannot put men on leashes. It's not politically feasible to put men on leashes.
You guys wrote that?
Yeah.
Yeah, they
or to
publish
yank
it.
their leashes when they misbehave.
Yeah.
And this paper didn't just get published. The journal said that this was exemplary scholarship and gave it an award.
Oh my God.
Says one of the best pieces. This year is their 25th anniversary. So this journal's been doing this for 25 years.
Yeah.
And it's their 25th anniversary. So they're picking out the best papers throughout the whole year and putting them, pride a place in some issue of their journal. And ours was going to be in the 7th issue.
So we want to, yeah. And then we wrote other papers like to Hypatia. We published got accepted, not published. But that one, we claim that it's unacceptable.
It's unethical to make fun of anything to do with social justice.
Right.
And so if you want to make fun of things that don't have anything to do with social justice, that's good. So if we wanted to make fun of men, that's great. If you want to make fun of white people, that's great. If you want to make fun of anything to do with social justice, that's a problem. So we said that, South Park's a huge problem. The Simpsons is a huge problem. We went into talking about how Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart have the right idea, but then the journal was like, but they're straight white males, so you have to, nuance around that to make it clear that their position as white men, even though they're on the side of social justice, it's not quite good enough,
So they published that.
They published that.
What
was that? What was that one called?
That one was called "When the Joke's on You."
Yeah.
It's so funny how racist you can be as long as you're racist against white people.
That's what we saw, is that as long as you are going up the river against privilege, then you can really just get away with some nasty stuff.
Yeah, and you could generalize.
Like, totally.
Gross generalizations.
Absolutely.
Do not treat people as individuals.
Absolutely.
Nope. It's very strange. It's very strange that this is the left.
Oh, yeah.
That this is the left. These are the people that are preaching against hate. Mm-hmm. And these are the people that used to be the people that were supposedly so open-minded and so open to ideas, and now they're trying to stifle creativity and stifle dissent and stifle anything that doesn't fit inside that very narrow paradigm that they're trying to push. It's very strange.
Yeah, they co-opted the civil rights movement. The good name of the civil rights movement is kind of the brand that they ride on. You know, they're fighting against racism. They're fighting against sexism, misogyny, etc. And the thing is that's not really what's going on here. They've actually tapped into this, to throw around the term, this postmodern notion that everything in society has to do with power dynamics. And the power dynamics have to be understood in terms of groups and how those groups have traditionally held power and exercised power. And so immediately it becomes stuck in this idea that it's all about this group or that group and how they relate to one another. And I don't mean like, hey, let's get along relate. I mean like white people are imagined to always be over black people, and therefore, you know, there's always this natural power dynamic of oppressor versus oppressed. And this is stuff that came straight out of this weird postmodern philosophy where you saw these to be.
This stifling of creativity is the most disturbing part about it. Like the agreement that South Park and The Simpsons are a real problem. It's so bizarre.
Yeah, we had two of them that did Mein Kampf. One of them we just more or less replaced Jews with white men. And you
literally took Mein Kampf, the actual words from Mein Kampf, and put it in this paper and replaced the word Jews with the word white men, and they accepted it.
Well, we had two papers that did Mein Kampf. Yeah. We had two versions.
So that one did not get accepted.
What were the quotes that you guys used?
I mean, so with that one, what we did was we took the whole document online and we just searched the word Jew. And we just started picking sentences and paragraphs. So what was it? That at the end it was something like, if we don't combat whiteness, it's going to be the funeral wreath for mankind. That's straight out of Mein Kampf. Now they didn't they didn't accept that paper though, because that paper turns out was written from the perspective of a white lesbian who hated her own whiteness, and they said that it was positioning her as a good white, and because she's making herself out as a good white, again, allyship isn't as all it's cracked up to be. She, you know, was making a problem. She should have really been forwarding the ideas of the black scholars that she read way more and not talking about herself so much, even though it was a paper designed to be talking about herself.
Yeah, because that was what Hitler did, so that's what we had to do.
Yeah. Now, the other Mein Kampf paper was about feminism, and what we did was we took the chapter, it's chapter 12, we took the chapter where he says this is why we should have the Nazi Party and what is expected of people who are going to be part of it. And we took out our movement or party. He didn't call it a Nazi party in the chapter, but everywhere he's like, our movement. Took that out, put in intersectional feminism. And then modified the words and added theory around it so that it would fly. And
theory?
Yeah, theory. That's what they call it.
I love that word.
Yeah, theory.
I love when feminist theory. I love when they throw that around. Like, what are you saying? But you're saying things that, like, once you say that, you're good. Like you can say something ridiculous and then say feminist theory, and they're like, "Oh, it's in feminist theory."
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Is so much of the stuff they come up with. Let me throw them an olive branch. Like so much of the stuff they come up with is a creative idea. Maybe there's something to some of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
But what they're putting forward is hypotheses, and then they're treating them as conclusions. So they're putting forward this idea. I saw one on Twitter today. It was something like, it was about South Park, how it's been laundering racism into society and making everybody comfortable with racism. And that's why everything's so racist and people are shooting Jews, is because South Park made it normal. But they're treating that as a conclusion, but that's a hypothesis, right? So we could test that. It's conceivable that you could actually try to parse out what variables need to be controlled, see, you know, South Park came out, it started doing these themes, how does it track? Statisticians can do kind of amazing things with that stuff, but they're not doing that. They're not testing it. Instead of testing it, they're concluding it, and they're using theory to do so.
And they're, go ahead.
No, it's even bigger than that, because why don't they test it? Well, if they tested it, and this is, I'm not making this shit up, you won't believe me, but this is true. If they tested it and the test showed that their hypothesis was wrong, they would say that the test was racist. Right. That the test is condoning racism, and that's why it didn't give them the desired result.
How would you test something like that?
Because, I mean, I'm not a statistician. I'm actually a mathematician, but I'm not a statistician. They're two different things. So I'm not exactly sure how you would test that. But conceivably, you could gather data, survey data, and see how attitudes have changed. Maybe you could track kinds of articles, kinds of events that are coming out. You could kind of pair that up with what's been shown on South Park.
Yeah, who are at South Park, and track that with attitudes. I mean,
but there's no effort to do this. They're like, oh, South Park presents these ideas, which they then cherry pick because there's other ideas that they don't talk about that are, you know, point the other direction. these ideas are problematic. That's the big word. Theoretically, that's a problem. Why? Because they, and I'm not joking, they literally believe that use of language creates the power dynamics that define society. So South Park's using language and imagery that creates a power dynamic that makes people more comfortable being racist. Boom. Theory. Done.
Right.
No
So
test needed. No even attempt test. And then if the test happened, the test itself would be racist unless it confirmed the hypothesis.
Right.
So I play in the playground of sociology of religion, but all my stuff, well, most of my stuff is quantitative. So I actually, I wasn't familiar with what was going, I go to conferences where everybody has to have strong empirical evidence. I publish in journals that are international journals that are, scientific study of religion is what we do. Right. So, you know, I'm familiar with Foucault and that stuff, but that's not where I play. So I wasn't really exposed to what's going on. And you don't really think, well, they can't.
There's no reason to be that concerned about it until about 3 years ago.
Well, this is it. But then I'm trying to get into the headspace of some of my colleagues. So I got out a textbook. It was called Race, Class, and Gender. And it's an anthology that's used in cultural studies courses and women's studies courses, and it's sort of the go-to text, so I'm told. And I'm reading it, and I turned to page 14, and I can tell you it's page 14 because I was so astounded by what I found. And it said, it says, objectivity as found through rational thought is a Western and masculine concept that we will challenge throughout this text.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I said,
it's too bad. It's too bad that you're shocked by that, because
I couldn't believe it. So you want to go for irrational?
The PC types have been saying exactly that since the 1970s. Like, that is exact. They make no mistake about this. This is why McClatchy is wrong. This isn't something they're secreting in. This is the dead statement. Oh yeah, it's that the whole notion of logic and coherence and empirical data, for that matter,
evidence.
The very nature.
Reject evidence.
Let's question the definition of evidence, because the underlying idea, remember, the underlying idea here is that all hierarchies are predicated on power. So if the reason that I put forward something as evidence isn't because it's evidence, it's because it's evidence that I get to have that position of power. And so if you're a postmodernist and you say, well, I'm going to question your evidence, what you think you're saying is you're going to question my claim to that arbitrary power. The whole idea that there's evidence outside of claims of arbitrary power, the postmodernists dispensed with that in the 1970s. That's Derrida. That's exactly what he said.
And all this time I've been trying to get samples of thousands so that I could say, you know, this is a little bit, we can say something, we can generalize.
No, that just demonstrates how thoroughly entrenched you are in the reigning patriarchal ideology.
I guess. And I was just hoping to get beyond anecdotal.
There's no beyond anecdotal. That's become a methodology.
Well,
that's
lived experience.
It's called autoethnography. There's a technical term for it. And autoethnography is the publication of a private diary, essentially, in a hypothetically reputable academic journal.
It's only because of, in the last 3 or 4 years, that these things have been happening that I say, well, where do they get this? How do they find these thoughts?
Yes, well, we don't want to fall into the mistake of making the assumption that this hasn't been thought through.
No.
People are not just misunderstanding what evidence is. That isn't what's happening at all. When they say they want to question the definition of evidence, that's exactly what they mean. When they say we want to question the definition of evidence because the definition of evidence currently supports the scientific power structure in chemistry, say, and that's fundamentally dominated by, let's say, white men, we can go after the definition of evidence itself, and that's how we're going to bring it down. And so the next people on the hit list are going to be the biologists. They're already under attack from the social justice warriors.
I just read a paper that said that mathematics is whiteness.
Yeah, definitely.
I didn't know that mathematics could have a race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thing is, there's nothing illogical about these claims once you accept this central axioms. The axioms are straightforward. The world is a battleground of power hierarchies. That's what it is. There isn't anything else outside of that. And each power hierarchy generates its own internal narrative, including rules for what constitutes evidence, that support and buttress the structure of that hierarchy. And because the hierarchies exclude, then it's in the best interests of the people who are excluded to invert the hierarchy. And of course, they also regard that as just, even though that's part of the incoherence of the entire argument. That's where they have to turn to Marxism. But make no mistake about it, this isn't accidental. It isn't people misunderstanding what constitutes evidence. Not at all.
Now, I've been listening to some of your lectures on this for the last year and thinking you sound a little deranged.
Well, I might be a little deranged, but I'm not deranged about this.
And what this did to create English Women's Studies department, absolutely out of the air. Just snap your fingers and create Women's Studies. The English department had taken a century to develop. Okay, it was a huge argument. Okay, within it, right? And all of a sudden, to create a department with a politicized agenda from the start, okay, by people without any training, whatever, in that field. Okay, what should be the parameters of the field? What should be the requirements of that field? How about biology? Okay, if you're going to be discussing gender, that should have been a #1 requirement, okay, as part of any women's studies department or program. Yes. But no, okay, it was all hands off. It was just the administrators wanted to solve a public relations problem. Okay? They had a situation with very few women faculty nationwide at a time when the women's movement had just started up. The spotlight of attention was on them. They needed women faculty fast. They needed the women's subject on the agenda fast, right? So they just like, poof, let there be women's studies, okay? And now we'll just hire some women, usually from English departments, you know, here and there, and we'll just throw them together. You invent it. You say what it is. So that's why women's studies got frozen at a certain point of ideology, okay, of the early 1970s. I was already in revolt from it, okay. I was a precursor in terms of my endorsement of feminism before even now was created, right? But I couldn't even have a conversation with any of these women. They were hysterical about the subject of biology. They knew nothing about hormones, okay. I mean, I probably got in fist fights over this. People were so convinced that biology had nothing whatever to do with gender differences, right?
See, that also seems to me to be related to the postmodern emphasis on power.
It's amazing because all the things we are saying are truer today than they were 21 years ago. About the excesses of feminism, the victimology, the male bashing, the panic over sexuality. At the time, 21 years ago, we were confident that it would be corrected. It was simply too mad to succeed. But it's still here.
I know. Well, Christina, we sent up early warnings. You heroically, in the late 1980s, were in direct confrontation with women's studies professors at a time when
philosophers.
Yes, at a time when I could not get published. Okay, and finally, after my first book, Sexual Personality, was released in 1990, you wrote to me and told me of your problems. Okay, and we've discovered each other as allies, and that our status, it seems to me, as truth tellers, okay, is historically unchallenged. Okay, and I think that people are going to start to wake up and to realize if they'd listened to us to begin with, we wouldn't have these problems now.
We wouldn't, and it was so obvious to me. I was criticizing the the feminist theorists at the American Philosophical Association, and what they were writing at the time was just warmed over Marxism, with so much animus to American society, to men, to everything, to art, to beauty, and it seemed to me that it wouldn't take long for it to correct itself. It was never corrected. And what happened is you and I did, I believe, won the argument in the, the journalists agreed with us and the court of public opinion was on our side. They won all the assistant professorships. They just quietly worked. They didn't care about criticism because all criticism is by definition backlash.
Well, a lot of people dropped out of graduate school. Okay? They're really free thinkers. You know, the independent minds couldn't take the kind of conformism and the PC ideology that they had to kowtow to. I mean, I got letters like that from once I was known in the early 90s. Letters came from all over the country, from former graduate students who said they knew they had no future in the profession, okay, because there was a total kind of brain dead attitude. You had a servile, sycophantish attitude you had to have to certain received opinions.
Absolutely. In our interview 21 years ago, you mentioned the sort of Kremlin-esque, feeling in feminism as a Kremlin-like environment, so much censorship and excommunication and so forth. And students today don't realize that there had been this this, kind of purge of anyone who was a dissident. I happened to have tenure when I started criticizing it, but it would be career diminishing or career annihilating to criticize feminism, even more so today.
When I was on college campus, I was active in the Israel debate about the peace process. When I speak to students today on campus, they say the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions debate about boycotting Israel, getting campuses to boycott Israel, it's no longer just between those who support one policy on Israel and those who oppose another policy on Israel, which it was like when I was going to college. Now those who are hostile to Israel or U.S. policy towards Israel are joined by almost like a coalition of all these different factions who know nothing about the issue, but they all lock arms.
That's right. So, because the key to the new morality is a method of looking at society and looking in terms of power and privilege. So the old idea of an education is come to campus, we're going to teach you lots of perspectives that you can use, let's look at poverty. What would an economist say? What would a Marxist say? We used to learn a lot of perspectives to look at a single problem. What's happening now is some students, again, it's only in a few departments, but they're learning one perspective to look at everything. And so you start, so there's a good kind of identity politics, which is, if black people are being denied rights, let's fight for their rights. That's the good kind. But there's a bad kind, which is to train students, to train young people to say, let's divide everybody up by their race and gender and other categories. We'll assign them moral merit based on their level of privilege is bad and victimhood is good. Okay, now let's look at everything through this lens. Israel, the Palestinians are the victims. So therefore, they are the good and the Jews, or the Israelis, are the bad. Right. And then so it's this one totalizing perspective. All social problems get reduced to this simple framework. I think we're doing them a disservice. I think we're actually making students less wise.
So, okay, I don't exactly know when I woke up, but I do know that when I was a social justice warrior, I was so incredibly angry all the time. And I'm already a person with a kind of temperament, as you probably know now. So me being angry all the time was horrible, because for me, anger is very exhausting and very emotional. I don't know how everyone else lives through it, but for me, being angry just would drain me. Like, I would fall asleep being drained even if nothing actually happened that day. So I remember even going to my classes, every time there was a male perspective or anytime a female was portrayed a certain type of way, my intuition would always be like, oh, go to the feminist thing, oh, go to like the male versus female thing. And sometimes that is the discussion, but sometimes it's not. And the fact that I was so deep into it, I always made that the discussion, even if it wasn't the central point, or even if females were represented a certain way for a certain reason, I always brought it back to feminism. And at that point, I also had quite a bit of white guilt. I felt like as a white person, I couldn't do anything without being, problematic or a racist or transphobic, misogynistic, ableist, whatever buzzword you want to choose. I thought I was gonna be that. So I was very uncomfortable in my body, and I still had my eating disorder at this point, and I even felt uncomfortable talking about that, because I was always thinking in my SJW fuck brain that, there are people that have bigger struggles than you. There are people dealing with racism. There are people dealing with transphobia. And while those things do happen, I don't think that racism is prevalent. I don't think transphobia is as prevalent anymore. And so I almost undermined my eating disorder a little bit because there were bigger problems. And honestly, in the world, there will always be bigger problems, but that doesn't change that my problems and your problems still exist. Whether you're white or whatever, race, ethnicity, whatever, you still have your problems and I still have mine. And so I felt that in a way, by being an SJW, I was separating myself more from these minorities than coming together, because I feel like when you're an SJW, you're so focused on talking about who's the victim, who's the victim, who's the victim, that you're just separating people instead of saying, let's all just be chill and not assholes. So that was definitely a big thing for me.
As most of you know, I'm a university student currently studying history, and in the university system of the school I'm in, there are a certain amount of gender and ethnic studies credits that people have to take in order to graduate. So I made the horrible decision of not only taking those classes the first semester that I was in college, but both at one time. I was barely 17 and I was really just a dumb kid, and I'm sorry to say I bought into this for about 5 minutes and they were the stupidest of my entire life. I don't know what I was thinking. This gender studies class that I took was actually specifically about gender and sexuality in Asia mostly. It was a 10-ish person class with one guy in it, and the professor was a lady, of course, and the ethnic studies class that I took was much larger. It was about maybe like a 300-person lecture, and the professor was a non-tenured French guy. The topics that we were supposed to talk about in the gender studies class were about like sati and child brides, arranged marriages, sex selection, abortion, and infanticide, and actual problems where feminism is probably actually needed. Somehow the conversation would always get back to American women and the perceived slights that we face, most of them having to do with the debunked wage gap and the rape culture myths. One time I think we were talking about how being called the C or the B word was the end of the world. I do think that feminism was at one point needed in the country when women couldn't vote or most women couldn't own property, but we American women I don't think have problems that feminism needs to fix. I think that women are doing much better than men currently, and that's because of the system that we live in. It was like the women in this class thought their problems were just as bad as like India's. There was one time where we were discussing gender, and the people in the class all believe in multiple genders, and they just wanted to completely reject the binary system. I one day decided to be a little brave, and I raised my hand and I said, do you think maybe the concept of two genders should be kept for if someone's going into the hospital and they need urgent care and they have a pain in their lower abdomen, then maybe we should keep that concept because then they would get care much quicker, much more quickly if the doctors knew whether they were a biological female or male, so they know what to look for. The entire room spoke up at once and started heckling me and just asking me so many, like, I could not hear anything just besides being heckled. The professor had to take control of the room and say, you know, they should just have a checklist. So, you know, he would say, I have a uterus, I have mammary glands, or something that wastes more time, rather than just checking off a box that states whether you have 2 X chromosomes or only 1. It was purely meant to virtue signal. It solved nothing. It actually solved nothing. I think that trans women understand that they are biological men. I tried to use science in a gender studies class. That was my bad. My bad. I should have known. There was this one girl in class that did a presentation on bindis, and she said that it was neat and reassuring that Western women thought that it was neat and they wanted to also partake in this part of the culture. Another girl raised her hand and practically accosted her for just... She accused her of ignoring cultural appropriation. And the best part? There were Indian girls in the class, and they said, most of them said that they did not care. When I took this class, I don't think that the gender fluid whatever was created yet, but there was this woman in class that claimed to be demisexual, which instead of just saying bisexual, and that you like to know a person before you have a relationship with them, you're trying to find a way to unnecessarily make things difficult so you can act morally superior when the average person knows that you're talking bull. One of the more ridiculous parts of the class was when we were learning about the awful things that happened in India, and we weren't allowed to say that it was a reflection on the culture. As in, we weren't allowed to say it was bad that women felt the need to throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyres in India, because all cultures are equal. A culture where it's okay to kill your female kids because you really wanted a boy is not equal to an egalitarian culture, and me saying that is politically incorrect. For the ethnic studies class, the professor did the same thing, where no culture is better than the other, but I at least agreed with him twice in the whole semester, and not 0 times. But we did learn about some racist ideologies like the study of whiteness, which is now a class in UW-Madison, and institutional racism, etc. We were told that El Cheapo is racist because you're demeaning the Spanish language. and that there's nothing wrong with forcing women to wear hijabs. And the professor once tried to convince us that capitalism was evil because people in China are having a rough time. It was a wild ride. I learned nothing besides how to be guilt-tripped for something I didn't do. I learned that people are very surprised to hear that I think third-wave feminism is not only unnecessary but patronizing, and it accomplishes nothing besides the opposite of its intentions. My main problem with these classes is that if your viewpoint is different than that of the professor, you were either prevented from speaking and not allowed to finish your point, or you were humiliated in front of the entire class because the professor has more status than you and is allowed to say, oh, you're just a stupid college student, you don't know what you're talking about. The ethnic studies professor, for example, would say he encouraged discussion in the class or different viewpoints, and then as soon as you spoke up and had a different viewpoint, you would raise your hand, he would let you finish, and then he would say, this is why you're wrong. In the gender studies class, if it seemed as though I was going to say something that was contrary to the groupthink, the professor would actually stop me and say I wasn't allowed to finish my point. And I think that it's just, I was used to it at this point. I went to public schools. It wasn't unusual to just have a liberal point of view presented to you, but it was disheartening, and I'm really glad that I joined a conservative group on campus because I don't know how I would do it otherwise.
I couldn't hold on to the sense of conviction. I can't think of a specific moment until, like by the time I started teaching full-time, I started teaching full-time in 1999. And at that point, I would have said that I was, I probably would have said I was still a feminist, but I would have seen myself as more of a moderate feminist. And that wouldn't have been my primary self-identification. I would have said I was an animal lover, you know, or something else like that.
Yeah.
But 9/11 was really that was my moment. And it was because at the university that I was teaching at the time, University of Saskatchewan, I'll never forget that morning. I was already at work. The secretary said that, you know, planes had flown into the towers, and I was horrified, but I noticed that the mood at the university, and in my department in particular, it was one of like barely contained, sort of vaunting pleasure.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. Or at least, I mean, maybe that's, you know, maybe not everybody felt that. That could have been just my sense of it, but certainly a kind of satisfaction. And in fact, one of my friends came into the mailroom and said, well, they've got what they deserved. Wow. This is like, you know, within an hour of the news. Another said that she was going to teach about it that day. And this was like really early on in the term. So she hadn't even really started. I think this would be like our
first week probably. Right?
Yeah, first week, or maybe the first part of the second week. But anyway, and she was going to teach about the event, and she was going to talk about how this would be used by reaction, how this would likely be used by reactionary forces in the United States, and how it would be very interesting to watch over the next few days who they would blame and how they would begin to manipulate. I thought, wow, like it hasn't, I mean, you know, she never even thought that maybe there would be students in the class who would be really upset, who might even, you know somebody who knew somebody, or, I mean, it was just the lack of human empathy and the hatred, the satisfied hatred. That was really my moment that turned me off completely from everything to do with the left, the progressivism, the anti-Americanism, the anti-Western culture, everything.
All right, now let's go back to Foucault. First point I want to make is the postmodernists, although I disagree with them, all of them are brilliant. All of them are deep. All of them are extraordinarily well-read particularly in the first generation postmodernists, the ones that I think are justifiably the names on everyone's lips when we need to talk about postmodernism. And the reason for that is that they go for the fundamentals. They really are drilling down to the deepest strata. So what is the deepest strata? Well, according to this this chart rather, the most fundamental thing is this modernist belief in the importance and the efficacy of human reason. That's how we acquire knowledge. If we really want to sort out the true from the false, we have to be sophisticated in the use of our rational capacity, logic, mathematics, scientific method, and so on. So, Foucault, it is meaningless, right, to speak in the name of, right, or against reason, truth, or knowledge. Okay. Now that's a big guns claim, right? The entire Enlightenment project relies on a claim about reason, and the claim is going to be that that claim is not only false, but just meaningless. Reason is a meaningless concept. Truth, right, is a meaningless concept. Knowledge is a meaningless concept. And one of the things that anecdotally we know when we start reading, right, postmodern thinkers is there's a strong dose of skepticism, right, and cynicism about any sort of positive value claim. One way that this is done graphically, right, is certain kind of success words epistemologically, right? Truth, right, or fact, right? They're always put in scare quotes, right? And that's a way of distancing yourself from it. You know, I'm going to use this word truth, right? And then ha-ha, right? That's the implicative. And this is where it's coming from. So what we do have in postmodernism is a very deep skepticism about the human capacity for knowledge. Right? And this is in contrast, right, to the claim that says, if we have faith, we can get knowledge. Or if we use reason, we can get knowledge. Both of those are going to be seen as false. There is no such thing as knowledge. Right? We've been trying for a long time. We can't figure it out. Therefore, we should realize the game is up. Now, the point then is going to be, right, and I'm harping on this, right, meaningless is a very strong claim, right? Poisman Fremister, right, that's just a meaningless phrase. Right? And the claim is, when I say knowledge, that's no different from Poisman Fremister. Actually, I can't even say it twice because I just made it up on the spot, right? Just a meaningless nonsense phrase. And of course, that's just a breakdown of communication. And if we want to communicate with each other, we shouldn't be using meaningless words and phrases. And so the implication is going to be, whatever we're doing, we're not talking about knowledge. We're not talking about truth. And we should just kind of set those concepts aside and do something else. Now, what does that mean? Because that's out there. Well, Richard Rorty. Try not to do death by PowerPoint, but this is another important, right, quotation here. The difficulty faced by a philosopher who, like myself, is sympathetic to this suggestion, that is to say, what Foucault just said, that truth, knowledge, etc., are meaningless. As one who thinks of himself as auxiliary to the poet, right, rather than to the physicist. Right, pause there. When we're talking about the Enlightenment, we're saying reason, scientific method, right, science, and so forth, that the job of the philosophers was to support and articulate to a large extent the whole scientific project that has transformed the world in the modern era. And what Rorty is suggesting here is that, no, we shouldn't be thinking of that, right? Because what do scientists think they're doing, right? They think they're studying the natural world and they're gathering facts, right? And they're doing logical interpretations, and they're getting closer and closer to the truth, right, of things. And we're really getting knowledge, right, of the way the world works. But if Foucault is right, that's not what we're doing. Right? So we shouldn't be thinking of philosophers as working with physicists. And so he says, yeah, instead I'm going to think of myself as an auxiliary to the poet. As a philosopher, whatever that is, I'm working with the poets. And the poets, and what the poets are doing is closer to, I can't quite use the word right, or true, because that would be paradoxical, but that's where we need to be. Okay? Now, what's the difference between a physicist and a poet? Right? Well, if you put it in philosophical terms, right, the scientists say, we are trying to be objective. Right? I might really want something to be true. I might be emotionally invested in a theory. But if the facts and the logic and the evidence goes against my theory, I'm going to have to set aside my feelings and what I want to be true because I'm committed to objectivity. Right? But if you're a poet, right, what is your mode of operation? Right? Well, you just make whatever you feel up, right? To put it crudely, right, you can make shit up. And that's fine. Because when you are doing poetry, you're expressing not necessarily a rational theoretical understanding of the world, but your subjective reaction to your circumstances, right, and the world, and you're putting it out there. And when I put my poem out there, your response to it is not, is this true and does this meet the canons of scientific method? Right? But rather your reaction is, does this push my emotional buttons in the right way and make me think and imagine things that I want to think and imagine? And so what Rorty is suggesting is if we then set aside, as we think we must, the Enlightenment project, that means we are setting aside objectivity, that physics project, and instead we are enshrining subjectivity. And the poets are the most human realization of human subjectivity. Now, that's kind of paradoxical, right, because it sounds like we're saying the right way to think about the human condition, right, is this way. But how can I talk about the right way without using the words truth, right? I can't say that I know this, right? And that's what he goes on to say, and this is the predicament, right, that we are in. I have to do this without avoiding, or hinting rather, that my suggestion somehow gets things right, that my philosophy corresponds to the way things really are, because as a skeptic, I can't know, right, what things really are. All right. So we're going in this way, and we're using language to suggest some new territory, but we're aware of these pitfalls. Okay. Stanley Fish, right? Duke University professor for a long time, Milton scholar, then actually moved to my state and became the highest paid public employee in the state of Illinois, made more than the governor as a superstar professor at one of the University of Illinois, right, campuses. Talking here about deconstruction, he's applying postmodern methods to literary criticism, and the label there for deconstruction is a literary method of applying postmodern techniques to techniques. And the claim is to say, this deconstruction's really pretty great because it relieves me of the obligation to be right. I don't have to worry about being right, right? What does this text really mean, and am I interpreting it right correctly, and should I have arguments and good evidence, right, and so forth. Instead of that objective, right, criterion, deconstruction just says, I just have to be interesting. Right? Okay. And what's interesting? Well, that's deuces wild. That's subjective, right? Right? And so you start to come up with creative, right, interpretations of the text, and there are not these constraints. So literature studies are going to go in a certain direction. Right? Frank Lantricchia was a colleague of Fish's while they was at Duke. Duke's University is very important, right, to this postmodern story. And there's a fork in the road here, because for some postmodernists, it's just a matter of being playful and interesting and coming up with cool interpretations that push your value buttons, the Fish option. But we also know that postmodernism has an agenda, right? There is a politics, right, at work, and this is what Lantricchia is going to argue here. He says, postmodernism, and this is now old news, seeks not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth. All right. So we're not interested in about the conditions of truth, right? That's what Foucault told us we don't do anymore. Rorty, right, agrees. Well, if we're not about truth, then what are we about? We are about exercising power for the purpose of social change. Okay? Truth is out, power is in. And then he immediately applies this to the education, because he's a professor, he has students, right, coming in on a regular basis. What should I be doing, right, as a professor? Well, the entire ideal of liberal arts education, right, is based on the Enlightenment vision. Every human being, including these young people who come into my classes, have the capacity for reasoning. And I have to expose them to the facts, lots of different experiences, and have lots of debates and discussions, right, among the students and with me about the different ways we might interpret, right, all of these facts and data. And we're going to put our interpretations up against the really smart people who've written the books that everybody, right, the other smart people think that we should read. And the idea is we are training the individual human being's capacity for thinking, for digesting their experience, for being open to new experience, to debate, changing their mind on all of the rhetoric and argument and so forth. That's what your job is as a professor, because that's what you think is the best way students can become truth seekers themselves and really come up with the kind of knowledge that they can rely on in their lives. But if all of that is out, what's left is power. My job as a professor, as he goes on to say, is to, quote, help students spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time. So John Gray is right. We do live in the dim ruins of the enlightened world. It's all crap right out there. My job as a professor is to train activists. And I use my power to do that. Recasting, right, of education on postmodern lines. Andrea Dworkin, right? It's not generic. We know that postmodernism comes in sub-brands, right? There are racial versions, there are feminist versions, there are environmentalist versions, there are ethnic versions, there are religiously based versions, right, and so forth. The Enlightenment said, right, every individual matters, all human beings should, right, be free to explore their own lives intellectually, politically, economically, and people should have certain rights and so forth, and so we strive for the extension of those liberties to all human beings. Everybody should ultimately be equal, and then we'll be, right, peaceful and progressive. Dworkin, right, in her postmodern phase, right, in a book called Intercourse, you don't want to read it, really, despite the sexy title. Right. Can you see the words at the back? Because I'm kind of a delicate person. Okay, I'll just say it, right? The normal fuck, right, by a normal man is taken to be an act of invasion and ownership undertaken in a mode of predation. So all this talk about, right, equal liberty and rights and human dignity, right, and extending the franchise and education opportunities, that's all a fraud. Right? And the reality is, right, men have their power agenda. Right? Women, of course, have their own power agenda, but there's unequal power, and that's the bottom line, and that carries into the bedroom. And to me, the most important word here from the Dworkin passage is the word normal, right? So it's not just that rapists are a minority of weirdos, right, among us, right, whom we need to deal with. This is what she takes to be the human condition in male-female relations. So that Enlightenment promise is, again, a fraud. We can extend this to international relations, right? We're not exporting democracy and markets and peace and prosperity for all when we are taking the Enlightenment vision and spreading it around the world and encouraging people to trade with us. Instead, we have a darker vision. Again, strong nations versus weak nations, and we'll have this rhetoric about trying to get along with each other, but really it's a matter of the strong nations, like the United States, imposing their agenda in various sneaky forms on all of the weaker nations in the world. And so really, the weaker nations of the world are always, right, the victims. Now, this is a reflection by Lyotard, Jean-Francois Lyotard, about the first Gulf War in the 1990s about Saddam Hussein. So what do you think about Saddam Hussein? Probably you've heard from this postmodern perspective, the CIA propaganda version, right, that he was a brutal dictator, right, who did bad things to his people, right, et cetera, et cetera. The truth is, oh, sorry, I can't say truth. The something or other is, right, that Saddam Hussein is a product of Western departments of state and big companies. Right? The powerful corporations and the powerful nations, just as Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were born of the peace imposed on their countries by the victors. Hitler was a victim. Mussolini was a victim. Right? Franco, a victim. Right? They were bad guys. That's fine. Right? But they weren't like homegrown, making their own problems and becoming evil. They are a symptom of the real badness, right, which is in the Western rich capitalist nations that have this rhetoric, right, about so forth. The Iraqi dictatorship proceeds, as do the others, from the transfer of aporias, right? That's a Greek word. If you're an academic, you have to throw a few of those in, which means problems in the capitalist system to the vanquished, less developed, or simply less resistant countries. So what we have here is the Marxist-Leninist theory of the exportation imperialistically of problems from the rich countries to the poorer countries. And that was a hint, but Derrida, right, makes it explicit, quotation, deconstruction. He's the big name in literary deconstruction. But here, he says, why is he a deconstructionist? And of course, there are philosophical issues, but he says deconstruction never had any meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization. That is to say, within the tradition of a certain Marxism, right, in the spirit, right, of Marxism. So Marx is important here, not the literal Marx, but some sort of Marxism, right, spirit sort of thing. And so the various kinds of neo-Marxism are going to be an important part of the story here. Now, the point of all of these selection of quotes is to set up, right, for then the same chart, but now we fill it in the way the postmoderns will do, right? Metaphysics, what is real? What is the nature of reality? The postmodern answer is going to be that that's a pointless question, that's a meaningless question. And in philosophy, we just call that position anti-realism. So we're not going to try to debate whether God really is real the way religious philosophy wants to do, or whether natural world is the only reality the way the more scientific minded. Both of them are making claims that they can figure out the way reality really is. The postmoderns are skeptical and to say we're just going to dispense with metaphysics as a discipline. We're anti-realist in point. How do we know? Well, the answer is going to be that we are subjectivists, right? But rather that we are socially, right, subjective. And that ties into a kind of social determinism. Language matters a lot. And the argument that often is the most prominent one is that we're born into certain linguistic groups. We learn a certain language at our mother's and our father's knee. But built into those languages a certain set of assumptions and ways of framing the world. And those get deeply baked into our understanding of the world. And we can't think outside of them. And so we are all prisoners of our linguistic groups and the various social things that come out of that. The groups, of course, different languages, different ways of thinking about each other, and we can't think past it, mean that those groups are going to be in conflict with each other. There's not going to be any rational way, logical way, discourse way of getting past our different understandings of the way the world works, so we're going to have group conflict. And I need to make good on this a little bit later in the talk here, but there's going to be a strong theme of egalitarianism. Right, equality of some sort is going to be the trumping value, right? But it's going to be a group equality that is the trumping value, and some kind of socialism. And again, those are fighting words, but I will make good on them. And that's where we are now. And if you put all of the charts together, that is a set of different answers to either the pre-modern or the modern chart. So we have pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, 5 philosophical issues, completely different packagings for each of them.
Segment 4, the theory, of which you have more in this book than I'd expected. Righteous indignation. A lot gets explained here. Marx and Hegel had paved the way for the progressives, who in turn had paved the way for the Frankfurt School, who had then attacked the American way of life by pushing cultural Marxism through critical theory. There's a lot going on there. Very briefly, what's the Frankfurt School? And why should anyone watching this interview care?
Okay, first of all, anyone that reads this book is going to laugh, and they're going to cry, and they're going to get Andrew in all of his zany different multiple layers. But there's one chapter that is like putting the medicine in the sherbet in order to get your kid to take it, in order to get rid of his fever. And to me, my one discovery, my one great epiphany, my one aha moment that I said, I got it. I see what exactly happened with in this country. The Frankfurt School were emigres from
Germany, Austria.
Germany. It was the equivalent of this, the Hoover Institution. What the Hoover Institution is to Stanford University. The Frankfurt School was a think tank at the University of Frankfurt, and they were social scientists like Herbert Marcuse, Antonio Gramsci, Horkheimer, Adorno. These were all a bunch of guys in the middle of World War II who had suffered in Europe, 2 world wars in a row, and they had been fighting. They had been fighting the Nazis, and they were trying to figure out another aspect of how to how to spread Marxism around the world. You could go to Bolivia, you could go to Bulgaria, and you could go to the peasant class, and you could say, let's flip this place. The Marxist-Stallman argument of getting the workers to get upset at the owners was very easy, but not in America, where the middle class was invested in their productivity, invested in the concept that they could have their own small little American dream, a white picket fence, that they could invent something and go from one generation to being dirt poor to being an owner within a very quick period of time. And what these guys figured out when they came to the United States, and Adorno is the one that drives me the most crazy. He came out to California, and I think it was Bertolt Brecht, the East German playwright, moved to Santa Monica in the 1940s at the height of the Golden Age. Think about this. These guys left Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy to come to California in the 1940s, and they lived by the beach, and they were depressed by the relentless cheeriness, the productivity, and the capitalism that they witnessed around them. And they came up with at the end of the day, we could call it cultural Marxism, but at the end of the day, we experience it on a day-to-day basis. And by that I mean a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. It's political correctness and it's multiculturalism. And what it took was this amazing concept of e pluribus unum, where everybody comes here and contributes to this, everybody becomes an American and contributes, but we have a common culture, we have a common border, a common mindset. What they did was take the haves versus have-nots friction and translated it into oppressor versus the oppressed. And
this got taken up by faculties across the country.
That's
the point of the Frankfurt School and the progressivism. It becomes embraced by 60s
post-structuralism
academics.
Post-structuralism, queer studies, African American studies, all of that is pitting people against each other. It is anti-American to its core.
If Marcuse was I'm quoting again from Righteous Indignation, if Marcuse was the Jesus of the New Left, then Saul Alinsky was his St. Paul. Again, let me just put it to you in simple terms. Who's Saul Alinsky, and why should anyone watching this interview care?
Well, Hillary Clinton wrote her senior thesis on Saul Alinsky at Wellesley. Barack Obama is an acolyte of Saul Alinsky. He created the concept of community organizing, and what he did, as I argue in this book, is he took all of this ethereal claptrap, this Noam Chomsky-like jargon that the average person couldn't understand.
Herbert Marcuse is very hard to read.
Right, it's all impossible to read. But he was able to translate this cultural Marxist down to a series of rules and a mindset, a warrior mindset, where the critical theory was like, take on your enemy, take him directly on, destroy that person. He applied critical theory down to the street war level, and I would argue that the Katie Courics of the world, the Chris Matthews of the world, Rachel Maddow, and Keith Olbermann, unbeknownst even to themselves, are studied in the tactics of Alinsky.
What we're seeing in the last few years is the rise of a particular subgroup that is extremely passionate morally about equality, about fighting racism, and that's all great. But they've adopted a way that is kind of vindictive, that is all about calling people out. So people are afraid of them. And it's not just the students, it's actually the professors too. So even if it's only 5 or 10% on any campus, the fact that they can file charges against a professor. Wow. At NYU, we have a new bias response team. So any video I show, anything I say in class, if it offends a student, there's numbers all over in every bathroom urging them to call, report me. So that changes the way we teach. And then, as Frank said, if students aren't exposed to diverse ideas, then if somebody like Charles Murray comes, well, you know, he spoke at Middlebury 10 years ago, and there was no big problem.
After his more controversial book. He's since then, his 2012 book, Coming Apart, which is, he was supposed to be much less controversial. That's what he was supposed to be speaking about.
It's quoted in opinion columns of the New York Times all the time.
Left and right.
That's right. And it's the biggest problem of our age. I mean, why did Trump win? It's the coming apart of the by class.
I was forwarded tweets where people were saying things like, I never knew Frank Bruni was such a racist. I was a racist because, so you asked how do Jonathan's colleagues react react to him. When I talk to people in higher education, he's a hero because he's bringing up stuff about free speech and ideological diversity that they know needs to be bring. But they won't say that in the public square, or they won't say the same things he's saying because they're so worried about a kind of shaming that the left right now, sadly, seems to specialize in.
Yeah, and I think this is really crucial. Mark Lilla had a piece in the New York Times right after the election on the problem of identity politics and how this may have alienated a lot of people and contributed to Trump's victory. And the response from many academics was ferocious. One of his colleagues at Columbia, within a few days, had some essay basically linking him to the Ku Klux Klan. Now, which is what happened. Yeah, that's right. But here's the point. So Lilla comes back with this brilliant point. He says, that's a slur, not an argument. And once he said that, I realized, oh my God, that is exactly what has been happening to me. I've been saying some pretty provocative things, beginning with an Atlantic article with Greg Lukianoff, and I keep looking on the internet for people who will respond to it, and pretty much nobody's arguing against me for anything I say. But I do get a lot of people basically saying, I'm a white male, or I somehow am winking at racism, something like that. So young people who go through these colleges, they're exposed to rhetorical training that prevents them from learning how to engage. They're trained carefully in how to basically discredit your opponent. Slur. Right. They learn to slur. They do not learn to argue.
So go look at the tape from Middlebury, and that's exactly what you see. You see students with their backs turned, and they're chanting slurs. They're not having an intellectual argument.
Let's have a look at another one of these community centers. How about the Multicultural Student Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I could go to a workshop on exploring racial injustice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison itself, where the workshop aims to center students of color experiences and empower white allies to interrupt racism. Or I could go to a workshop on the privilege of whiteness. Participants in this workshop will be able to describe privilege and marginalization. They will also reflect on and name the ways their privilege impacts their beliefs and behaviors by gaining the skills to identify the historical roots of white privilege and how it manifests today. The workshop is designed for a white audience, but people of color are welcome. Well, that sounds totally legit. Nothing unhealthy about that at all. Let's look at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. In the College of Education Department of Student Development, Social Justice Education Concentration. Now, I know that sounds like it's some kind of SJW gulag, but I am assured that it is not. Let's look in the Social Justice Education Bodies of Knowledge and Practice. They teach specifically about prejudice and discrimination, the dynamics of power and privilege, and of course, intersecting systems of oppression. Because how would people know that they're being oppressed if you don't teach them that they are being oppressed? But also socio-cultural and historic context for and dynamics within, among the specific manifestations of oppression: adultism, religious oppression, ableism, classism, ethnocentrism, heterosexism, racism, sexism, transgender oppression, in other educational and social systems. Where did you think Tumblr was getting all of this bullshit, just out of interest? Social justice education's central focus is the preparation of professional educators, counselors, and change agents who are able to understand and work effectively with social justice issues in a formal and non-formal educational setting. It provides graduate degree programs of study for educational professionals who teach and practice at all levels of the educational system, kindergarten through college, as well as in after-school programs, youth development programs, and other community-based organizations working with students of all ages. We hope to attract educational professionals whose primary responsibilities include teaching, school guidance, and counseling, the supervision of professional development of teachers, school counselors, school psychologists, education administrators, student affair programmers, special educators, or college resident educators. Oh, how wonderful! This is the priestly caste of social justice, finding invisible oppression everywhere, and now teaching people how to teach this invisible oppression to their students. And you just know that those after-school programs and youth development programs, well, you know, we'll cover them in a minute because they are just magical. So anyway, you've created your priestly class of enlightened educators, and they're going to educate the students in the ways of social justice. But what then? I mean, you don't just want to just stop there, really, do you? I mean, what good would it be to teach them all of this and not encourage them towards activism? I mean, let's see what they do at the Center for Social Justice at the University of Oklahoma. The programs of the Center for Social Justice work together to provide practical and academic tools to better understand our local and global communities. We offer experiential learning alongside an interdisciplinary curriculum that focuses on the complexities of and critical analysis of structural inequalities and injustices within a variety of fields. And you can do this by getting a social justice minor. Students can pursue a minor in social justice through the Women and Gender Studies program. Courses offered through the social justice minor introduce students to the complexities of structural inequalities and injustices, while teaching students critical thought processes. So what does that actually involve though? Well, it involves social justice events and activism. Our events integrate social justice awareness and promote the importance of activism in students' everyday lives. The Center events include film festivals, workshops, awareness campaigns, fundraisers, discussion groups, art shows, book clubs, symposiums, lunches and lectures, etc. Well, it's no wonder that SJWs are getting all up in everyone's business. They are being encouraged to do it as part of their courses. At Oklahoma, they even have an activist in residence. Every semester, we bring a social justice activist to campus. The activists come from a variety of social justice backgrounds and travel to Norman from around the world. Activists hold workshops, lead discussion groups, teach classes, screen movies, assisting planning projects and campaigns, and are available to students for informal conversations. Well, I mean, that kind of does explain the 2015 student uprisings across America, doesn't it? If you are an SJW who's interested in knowing more about this, or you're a white person interested in paying reparations, you can go to thedemands.org and see the list of 79 different college campuses that are represented on here. We'll have a look at one of these for now, Amherst College, because we've already covered it, but all of these are the same in character. We, the students of Amherst College, refuse to accept the negative social climate created towards our peers of colour and other marginalised groups. We have begun this movement, Amherst Uprising, in an effort to change the status quo for a more just and inclusive environment within our campus. We demand that Amherst become a leader in the fight to promote a better social climate towards individuals who have been systematically oppressed. Student leaders acknowledge and support the demands previously stated and currently being presented. Furthermore, we demand the college acknowledge its ethical and moral responsibilities as an institution and community of our world. Amherst College should not be complicit in oppressive organizations and systems, no less. Well, blow me down. I can't believe that a bunch of professors teaching each other how oppressed certain groups are, and then teaching students that these groups are all oppressed and encouraging them to activism has led to this. A mass student demonstration over bullshit. Shall I show you how they demonstrated? And you'll want to break out your copy of the Communist Manifesto just to really remind yourself where this comes from.
It is our duty to fight.
It is our duty to fight.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
It is our duty to fight.
It is our duty to fight.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
It is our duty to fight.
It is our duty to fight.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We have nothing to lose.
We have nothing to lose
but our chains.
but our chains. another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have a duty to fight.
We have a duty to fight.
We have a duty to win.
We have a duty to win.
We must love and protect one another.
We must love and protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have a duty to fight.
We have a duty to fight.
We have a duty to win.
We have a duty to win.
We must love and protect one another.
We must love and protect one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Is there anyone who actually thinks this is not a major problem? Is there anyone who thinks this is not a cult? Is there anyone who thinks this is education? It should not surprise anyone to know that there are very few instances of racial hate crimes on university campuses in America. There have, however, been over 100 hate crime hoaxes in the past 10 years on these campuses, because the students are being taught that there is racism everywhere, and when they can't find any, it's okay to make it up, because, as we all know, there is racism everywhere. So even if this specific example is false, it doesn't matter. But what's more, the number of these hoaxes is increasing, presumably because students feel even more justified in creating a hoax to bring attention to the problem of racism. We're even seeing the signs of universities beginning to racially segregate because of this ideology. The universities of Vermont and Oregon have begun hosting social justice retreats, which incidentally are racially segregated and costing the taxpayer thousands of dollars. On the racial Aikido retreat, non-white people will be taught how to respond to overt and covert racism, whereas on the white retreat, white people will be taught how to check their privilege. And you might be thinking, why? Why are they racially segregating in anything to do with the university these days? And the answer is, the student activists are demanding it. Black college students from across the country have demanded that they be segregated from white peers, calling for safe spaces on campuses meant for only so-called students of colour. All of this is the logical conclusion of teaching black students that they are being oppressed by the white students, because all black people in America are living in a white supremacist system. Is it any wonder that they're going to think the only way they can get away from this is by getting away from white people entirely?
When did this start? When did the trigger warnings? When did the safe spaces? When did all this emerge?
Well, it has its roots in the student radicalism of the 1960s, especially the far left radicalism. It really popped up in the 1990s, in the early 90s, when I was teaching in the U.S. at that point. And
which university?
I taught at Harvard from 93 to 98. And there was a fair push for political correctness, especially in the early part of the 90s. But it got pushed back down and disappeared and went underground. It went underground is more accurate. And then it's just come back with a vengeance in the last 5 years. And I think it's partly because we have all these radical left political activist departments at the universities, women's studies being at the top of the list, that have done nothing for the last 30 years. It's even longer than that now. It's almost 40 years. 30 years, let's say. Have done nothing but produce a never-ending stream of ideologically minded counter-civilization political activists. And that's all subsidized by tuition and by the public purse. And that's another thing we really got to ask ourselves, is why the hell are we subsidizing revolution? Why are we doing that? It's crazy. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous.
So what exactly is going on with women's studies that you believe is fostering revolution?
Well, you go on their websites and read what they say. I mean, first of all, for the women's studies types, and this is, what would you call it, false anthropology. There's this idea that way back when there was a feminist paradise, and that would be like noble savage mode of living where everything was egalitarian and women dominated. It was a matriarchal culture. that was put forward by a UCLA anthropologist named Gembutes. I can never pronounce her name properly, but I think I got it. And then that was overthrown by patriarchal institutions, essentially starting at about the time, say, of Judaism. And that was all overthrown, and ever since then we've lived in an oppressive patriarchy. And now that's what our culture is. It's an oppressive patriarchy.
So they're pointing to one unsuccessful society that they believe existed, or did it actually exist?
No, it didn't exist. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. It's complicated, but it's the telling of a kind of psychological myth as if it was history.
Whoa.
And anyway, so the basic claim is that Western civilization is a brutish patriarchy, and that whatever positive things it might have managed to accomplish were all accomplished as a consequence of oppression and theft, and that the appropriate thing to do is to restructure it from the bottom up. And they mean that. They mean that. They mean every single bloody concept. And you can marry that with modern postmodernism and throw in a nice dash of Marxism, and you have the ideological and motivated grounds for social revolution. And I'm just go online and look at a dozen women's studies websites. Just read them. You can see what they say. They produce political activists, and their goal is to restructure the patriarchy. Well, what's the patriarchy? Well, the patriarchy is Western civilization. And what does restructure mean? That's easy. It means tear it down and destroy it. Why? Because it's a brutish system that's predicated on nothing but oppression. It's nothing but a tyranny in the eyes of the radical women's studies types. Heterosexuality, that's a tyranny. Capitalism, that's a tyranny. Democracy, well, that doesn't even exist, and even if it did, it would be a tyranny. Everything's a tyranny. And so you can ask these, and what would they replace it with? They replace it with their own ideological utopia. Well, we've already had 100 years of that. We saw what happened. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. That wasn't real Marxism. That's what the bloody Marxists always say. That wasn't real Marxism. It's like, oh, how many millions of people have to die before you're convinced that it's real Marxism? And I know what they mean by that, too. They mean, hey, if I was the Marxist dictator, things would have gone a lot better. It's like, you should think again, sunshine. If you were the Marxist dictator, things wouldn't have gone a lot better. So, and if you're the sort of person that thinks that if you would have been in control, things would have gone a lot better, then you're exactly the sort of person who should never be in control. So, and it's resentment. It's horrible resentment, you know.
Well, that's an important point, because I think this is something that you've said that I absolutely agree with, that I think a lot of this thinking and the way people are behaving, it seems based on revenge. It seems based on revenge for awkward upbringings, social uncomfortability. It seems like there's something about the way they view the world where they want to get back at people that have literally done them no wrong.
It's resentment for the burden of being. It's deeper. It's deeper. I mean, human existence is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. You know, we're limited creatures, and life is very hard. Everyone dies. Everyone you love is going to die. Most of the things you do, all of the things you do, will eventually fail. You know, suffering is a certainty, and it's very easy for people to become resentful about being, about existence. You know, these kids who shoot up high schools and these mass shooters, they're the perfect examples of people who run on nothing but resentment. They're out to kill the innocent because that's the best marker of, that's the best way of showing just how much contempt they have for existence itself. Why punish the guilty? They deserve to be punished. It's a lot more malevolent and vengeful to punish the innocent. It's like people are motivated to a great degree by resentment of being. And a huge chunk of that is manifested in, that's the dark side of ideological possession. So I get to decide who my enemies are, and then I get to go after them, and I can go after them for every single thing that's ever been done to me that isn't good. And well, a lot of that's just built into the structure of existence.
Then they group up. They exhibit confirmation bias. They all form some sort of a groupthink, and then they act accordingly. And this is what you've been warning against, and this is where I completely agree with you, and this is why I think the subject is so important, and I love the way you've outlined all the steps and the problems with Marxism and ideologies in general, that we are dealing with this. These are the beginning steps of it, and people who look at it now and they say it's social change, it's social justice. It's not. It's not.
It's not. That's right. It's not. And this is not going to improve things. Implementing these policies will make things worse. They've made things worse every single place they've ever been implemented. And often they've made things so much worse that you actually can't imagine it. And people don't do the reading. I've done the reading. I've done the reading. I know how bad things can get. They can get so bad that no matter how bad you think they are, you're not even in the bloody ballpark.
Well, it's just so strange that these sort of courses and these sort of ideologies are thriving in universities. And it's really disconcerting to someone who has children. And you know that your children are going to go there and they're going to be exposed to these ideas.
You know, I think that I think
a
that
guy
the
used to teach at Harvard just says send them to trade school.
I think the universities. I think the universities. I think you can make a reasonable case that the universities do more harm than good now. I hate to say that. And when one of the things I learned about studying totalitarian systems, whether they were on the right or the left, was that part of the reason that the totalitarian horrors of the 20th century manifested themselves was because average people didn't take on the proper responsibility. They shut their eyes when their eyes should have been open, even though they knew it. And they did and said things they knew they shouldn't have done and said. And that was what supported those horrible systems. So, if you don't get your act together, then you leave a little space for hell.